The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone could stop it. Alexander Hartley, Duke of Ashbourne, stood frozen for only a moment as the sound echoed through the grand hall of Ashbourne Manor. His grandmother, Dowager Duchess Eleanor Hartley, had thrown the crystal goblet herself, her hand trembling not from age, but from fury. 7, she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through stone. 7 young women in 2 years, Alexander. 7 families insulted. 7 reputations bruised, because you could not bring yourself to sit through a single dinner without finding a reason to send them away. Alexander said nothing. He bent down, picked up a shard of glass, and set it carefully on the side table, as though tidiness could somehow answer the accusation in her eyes. I did not summon anyone here tonight to be scolded like a schoolboy, he finally said, straightening his coat. Miss Ainsworth was perfectly pleasant. I simply did not feel— You never feel, Eleanor snapped, cutting him off. That is precisely the trouble. You stand in rooms full of accomplished, beautiful, intelligent women, and you feel nothing. Do you imagine feeling arrives on its own, Alexander? Do you imagine love simply falls into a man's lap while he stands with his arms folded, judging every woman who walks through the door? He turned toward the tall windows, where the evening light was fading over the gardens of the estate. Outside, servants were already clearing away the remains of yet another failed courtship dinner, carrying trays of untouched food back toward the kitchens. I am not against marriage, grandmother, he said quietly. I am against pretending. I have watched too many men in our circle marry for title, for land, for convenience, and call it love, because it was easier than admitting the truth. I will not be one of them. Eleanor's expression did not soften. If anything, it hardened further, the way flint hardens under pressure rather than crumbling. And so instead, she said, you will let the Hartley name end with you. You will let 300 years of history disappear because you are waiting for a feeling that may never come, while young women weep in their carriages on the way home, humiliated in front of their families for a crime they did not commit, simply existing, and hoping you might like them. The accusation landed harder than she perhaps intended, and for a moment, something in Alexander's jaw tightened. He was not a cruel man. He had never wanted to be cruel. But cruelty, it seemed, was what remained when a man refused to lie about his feelings in a world that expected performance instead of honesty. What would you have me do? He asked. Marry the next woman who walks through that door, simply to please society? I would have you trust me, Eleanor said, her voice suddenly quieter, though no less firm. For once in your stubborn life, Alexander, I would have you trust that I know something you do not. He turned to look at her properly then. There was something in the way she said it, not the tone of a grandmother scolding a grandson, but the tone of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing him of it, rather than asking permission. What have you done? He asked slowly. Eleanor walked toward the window herself, looking out at the darkening gardens, where the last carriage of the evening was pulling away down the long drive, carrying Miss Ainsworth and her disappointed parents back toward London. I am dying, Alexander, she said, and the words landed in the room, like the earlier shattering glass, sudden and impossible to take back. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides. Grandmother. Do not, she said, raising a hand before he could reach her. Do not fuss over me, as though I have not lived a full life already. The physician says months, perhaps a year if I am fortunate. I have made my peace with it. What I have not made peace with is leaving this family without an heir, without a future, without a woman by your side who might actually understand you, rather than simply admire your title. Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest, a fear he had not expected. He had always known his grandmother would not live forever, but hearing the words spoken aloud, in that room, on that particular evening, made the truth suddenly, unbearably real. Then let me choose someone properly, he said. Give me time, I will find someone. You have had 2 years, Eleanor said. You have rejected 7 brides in 2 years, and every single one of them was chosen with your preferences in mind. Wealth, beauty, connection, wit. I gave you every advantage society could offer, and you found fault with all of it. So this time, Alexander, I am not asking your opinion before I choose. I have already chosen. The words hit him harder than the earlier admission of illness, in a strange way, because they left no room for argument. Chosen, he repeated. Without consulting me at all? You would have refused her before she even entered the room, Eleanor said simply. I know you well enough to know that much. Who is she? Eleanor did not answer immediately. She walked slowly to a chair near the fireplace and lowered herself into it, the movement betraying an exhaustion she usually hid well. Alexander noticed, with a pang of guilt, how thin her hands had become, how the rings she wore now slid loosely on her fingers. Her name is Clara Bennett, Eleanor said finally. Alexander searched his memory for the name and found nothing. No title, no family he recognized from society gatherings, no connection to the usual circles of nobility that filled his days with tedious introductions. I do not know that name, he said. No, Eleanor agreed. You would not. She is not a duchess's daughter, nor an earl's niece, nor anyone your circle would consider worth noticing at a ball. She comes from modest means. Her father was a merchant who lost most of his fortune before he passed. She has spent the last several years caring for her aunt, managing a household with very little money, and even less help. Alexander stared at his grandmother as though she had suggested he marry a stranger off the street. In many ways, to his mind, she had. You cannot be serious, he said. The Duke of Ashbourne, marrying a woman with no title, no fortune, no standing whatsoever? Society would tear us both apart. They would say I had lost my senses, or worse, that the Hartley name had fallen so low it needed rescuing by charity. Let them say what they like, Eleanor said, her tone suddenly fierce again, despite her frailty. I did not choose her for her fortune, Alexander, nor for her name. I chose her because 3 years ago, when I fell ill during my visit to Bath and every fashionable acquaintance I had made excuses to avoid my sick room, it was Clara Bennett who sat beside me through the night. She was merely a companion to another guest at the time, hired for the season, with no obligation to me whatsoever. And yet she stayed. She held my hand when the fever was at its worst. She read to me when I could not sleep. She asked for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. And when I recovered, she simply returned to her modest life, without expectation of reward. Alexander said nothing, though something in his chest had begun to shift, almost against his will. I have watched countless women flatter you, flatter me, flatter anyone who might advance their position, Eleanor continued. Clara Bennett has never once tried to flatter anyone in her life. She does not know how. She has spent her days working, caring for others, surviving with dignity, despite circumstances that would have broken many people I know. If you cannot see the value in that, Alexander, then perhaps I truly have failed to raise you as I intended. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Alexander walked to the window again, staring out at the darkness that had now fully claimed the gardens. And you expect me to marry her, he said, a woman I have never met, a woman with no experience of the life she would be expected to lead as a duchess. I expect you to meet her, Eleanor corrected. I am not so cruel as to force a marriage on either of you, without at least the courtesy of an introduction. But I will tell you this, Alexander, and I will tell you plainly, because I no longer have the luxury of time to speak in riddles. If you reject Clara Bennett the way you rejected the 7 before her, I will not choose another. There will be no 8th attempt. You will inherit this title with no wife, no heir, and the full weight of disappointing everyone who has ever believed in you. Alexander turned to face her, searching her expression for any sign of exaggeration, any hint that she might be testing him rather than delivering an ultimatum. He found none. Her eyes, though tired, were utterly resolute. When do I meet her? He asked finally, his voice quieter than before. Tomorrow, Eleanor said. She arrives at noon. And Alexander, she paused, waiting until he met her gaze fully. I would ask that you give her the same courtesy you have given no one else in 2 years. Listen before you judge. Watch before you decide. You may find that the woman I have chosen is nothing like what you expect. That night, Alexander did not sleep. He sat by the window of his private study long after the household had gone quiet, staring out at the moonlit grounds of the estate that had belonged to his family for generations. He thought of his grandmother's illness, of the years he had spent rejecting bride after bride in search of something he could not even properly name, of the strange, unfamiliar name that now hung in his mind like an unanswered question. Clara Bennett. He tried to imagine her and found he could not. Every woman he had met in society carried herself a certain way, spoke a certain way, dressed to draw attention in rooms designed for exactly that purpose. He had no frame of reference for a woman who had spent her life caring for others rather than being cared for, who had sat beside a dying stranger's bed with no thought of reward. Part of him wanted to dismiss the entire arrangement before it began, to send word in the morning that the meeting would not take place, that his grandmother's scheme, however well-intentioned, was doomed to fail like every attempt before it. He had built a fortress around his heart over the past 2 years, brick by brick, rejection by rejection, and the thought of allowing a stranger past those walls filled him with a resistance he did not fully understand. But another part of him, quieter and harder to ignore, kept returning to his grandmother's words. She asks for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. In 2 years of courtship dinners and carefully arranged introductions, he had never once heard those words used to describe any woman brought before him. Every conversation had circled back, eventually, to what she might gain from marrying a duke: land, title, security, position in society. He had grown so used to searching for hidden motives that he had begun to wonder if genuine kindness, offered without expectation, even existed anymore among people who knew his name. Perhaps, he thought as the candle beside him burned low, that was precisely why his grandmother had chosen a woman who did not know it at all, not truly, not in any way that mattered to her daily survival. A woman who had cared for a stranger simply because the stranger was suffering, with no thought of what a duchess's gratitude might one day be worth. He did not know, as he finally rose from his chair near dawn, whether he hoped Clara Bennet would prove his grandmother right or wrong. He only knew that for the first time in 2 years, he was not dreading the meeting ahead of him. He was afraid of it, in a way he could not fully explain, but it was not dread. It was something closer to the unfamiliar, uncomfortable feeling of genuine curiosity, and that alone was enough to keep him awake until the first light of morning touched the windows of Ashbourne Manor. By the time the sun rose fully over the estate, servants were already preparing the drawing room for the noon arrival, polishing silver that had not been used in weeks, arranging fresh flowers cut from the greenhouse, airing out a room that had seen 7 failed courtships and was, this time, expected to host an 8th. Alexander dressed carefully, but without vanity, choosing a simple dark coat rather than anything ornate, telling himself it did not matter what impression he made on a woman he had already half decided to send away out of habit. And yet, standing before the mirror in his chamber, straightening his collar with unusually careful hands, he found himself wondering, against his own better judgment, what kind of woman could hold a dying stranger's hand through the night and ask for nothing at all in return. The clock in the hall struck 11. 1 hour remained before Clara Bennet would arrive at Ashbourne Manor, and Alexander Hartley, Duke of Ashbourne, found himself standing at his window, watching the long drive that led up to the estate, waiting for the first sign of a carriage he had never expected to see. The carriage arrived 7 minutes early, which was the first thing about Clara Bennet that surprised Alexander Hartley. He watched from the window of his study as the modest black carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, far plainer than the gleaming vehicles that usually delivered hopeful brides to Ashbourne Manor. There were no gold trimmings, no matched horses dressed in ribbons, nothing to announce wealth or status. Just a simple carriage, slightly worn at the edges, pulled by 2 tired-looking horses that had clearly traveled a long distance that morning. He made his way down to the entrance hall just as the front doors opened, and there she was. Clara Bennet was not what he expected, though he could not have said precisely what he had expected in the first place. She was neither strikingly beautiful in the way society prized, nor plain in a way that might explain her absence from fashionable circles. She was simply herself, dark hair pinned back without elaborate curls, a traveling dress of practical gray wool rather than silk, and eyes that met his directly, without the practiced shyness most young women adopted when meeting a duke for the first time. "Your Grace," she said, offering a proper curtsy, though there was something almost businesslike in the way she performed it, as though acknowledging a formality, rather than expressing genuine deference. "Miss Bennet," he replied, inclining his head. "Thank you for making the journey." "Your grandmother's letter was quite persuasive," Clara said, "though I confess I am still not entirely certain why I am here." The honesty of the statement caught him off guard. Every woman who had come before her had arrived with careful words prepared, compliments ready on their lips before they had even crossed the threshold. Clara Bennet, it seemed, had not bothered to prepare anything at all. Perhaps we should discuss that over tea, Alexander said, gesturing toward the drawing room, where Eleanor was already seated, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. The drawing room had been arranged with the same care as every previous courtship meeting. Fresh flowers, polished silver, a fire crackling gently in the hearth despite the mild weather outside. Clara took her seat with a composure that seemed entirely natural rather than practiced, folding her hands in her lap and glancing briefly around the room, taking in the grandeur without any visible awe or ambition in her expression. "Clara, my dear," Eleanor said warmly, extending a hand toward her. "It is good to see you again. You look well." "As do you, Your Grace," Clara said, though the slight hesitation in her voice suggested she had noticed, and worried about, the changes in Eleanor's appearance since their last meeting. "I am afraid I am not entirely well," Eleanor admitted, "but that is a conversation for another time. Today, I wanted you to meet my grandson properly, without the burden of ceremony that usually accompanies these introductions." Clara turned her attention to Alexander, and for the first time since her arrival, he felt genuinely studied, as though she were assessing him with the same directness she had shown at the door. "I understand there have been several introductions before mine," Clara said, not unkindly, but without softening the observation either. "7, I believe, according to the servants who whispered about it on my way in." Alexander felt a flicker of something between embarrassment and amusement. The servants gossip more than the guests, apparently. "They do," Clara agreed, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. "Though I imagine it must be tiring, meeting so many people who are hoping to become your wife, all while trying to determine whether any of them actually deserve the position." "You speak as though you have given the matter some thought," Alexander said. "I have had little else to think about since receiving the invitation," Clara admitted. "I am not accustomed to being summoned by dukes, Your Grace. I confess I spent most of the carriage ride wondering what precisely I am meant to offer that 7 other women could not." The bluntness of her answer, delivered without flirtation or false modesty, left Alexander momentarily without a response. He glanced at his grandmother, who was watching the exchange with an expression of quiet triumph, as though she had known exactly how this conversation would unfold. "Perhaps," Alexander said carefully, "the Duchess believed you might offer something different, rather than something more." "And what would that be?" Clara asked. "Honesty, perhaps," he said. "You are the first person to sit in this room and admit you are uncertain why you were invited, rather than pretending you have always dreamed of marrying a duke." Something shifted in Clara's expression then, a flicker of understanding, rather than surprise. "I would be lying if I said the idea holds no appeal, Your Grace. A title, security, a life free from the constant worry of how to pay for coal in the winter. These things matter to someone who has spent years without them. But I did not come here pretending to love you, nor pretending that I know anything about you beyond what your grandmother has told me. I came because she asked, and because I owe her a debt I can never properly repay." "A debt," Alexander repeated, glancing toward his grandmother. "She sat with me through my fever 3 years ago," Eleanor said quietly, before Clara could answer. "I have already told him the story, Clara. There is no need to be modest about it." Clara's cheeks colored slightly, the first sign of genuine emotion she had shown since entering the room. It was nothing more than any decent person would have done. It was considerably more than the decent people I was surrounded by at the time were willing to do, Eleanor said firmly. "I remember it clearly, even through the worst of the fever. Every fashionable acquaintance I had made excuses to leave the room. You stayed." Alexander studied Clara more closely then, watching the way she seemed uncomfortable receiving praise, as though kindness were something to be performed quietly and forgotten, rather than acknowledged and celebrated. It was, he realized, entirely unlike the 7 women who had come before her, each of whom had seemed to collect compliments the way a merchant collects coins, carefully and with clear purpose. "Tell me about yourself, Miss Bennet," Alexander said, deciding to steer the conversation toward more practical matters. "Your grandmother tells me your father was a merchant." "He was," Clara said, "a good man, though not always a wise one, when it came to business decisions. He lost most of what he built in the years before his passing, largely through misplaced trust in partners who did not deserve it. My mother died when I was young, so it was mostly my father and myself, and later, my aunt, once his health began to fail." "And you have managed on your own since then?" "Largely, yes," Clara said. "I took work as a companion where I could find it. managed my aunt's household when her own health declined, and learned to make very little money stretch much further than it probably should. It is not a glamorous life, Your Grace, but it has taught me a great deal about what truly matters when circumstances are difficult." "And what does truly matter?" Alexander asked, genuinely curious now. Clara considered the question for a moment before answering. "People, mostly. Not their titles or their fortunes, but whether they are kind, when kindness costs them something. Whether they tell the truth when a lie would be easier. Whether they show up for you when there is nothing to be gained from doing so." The answer settled into the room quietly, and Alexander found himself unable to immediately respond. He had spent 2 years listening to carefully rehearsed answers about love, duty, and devotion, delivered by women who had clearly practiced their words in front of a mirror before arriving. Clara's answer had the unmistakable quality of something spoken because it was true, rather than because it was expected. "That is not the answer I anticipated," he admitted. "What answer did you anticipate?" Clara asked. "Something about love, I suppose, or duty. The usual sentiments offered in rooms like this one." "I do not know you well enough to speak of love, Your Grace," Clara said plainly. "And duty is a word people use when they mean obligation, but wish to make it sound noble. I would rather tell you what I actually believe than offer you a pleasant lie." Eleanor, who had been watching the exchange in silence, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile, though she said nothing, careful not to interrupt whatever was beginning to unfold between her grandson and the woman she had chosen for him. The conversation continued through the afternoon, moving from Clara's modest upbringing to Alexander's responsibilities as Duke, from questions about the estate to Clara's careful, thoughtful observations about the tenants she had glimpsed on her journey up the drive. She asked about the welfare of the workers on his land, with a genuine curiosity that surprised him, questions no previous bride had thought to ask, focused as they had been on ballrooms and social calendars, rather than the people whose labor sustained the very fortune they hoped to marry into. By the time the afternoon light began to soften, and Clara rose to take her leave, Alexander realized, with some discomfort, that he had not once found himself searching for a reason to end the conversation early, as he had with every woman before her. If anything, he found himself wishing there were more time before the carriage arrived to take her back to whatever modest lodging she called home. "Thank you for receiving me, Your Grace," Clara said at the door, offering the same business-like curtsy she had performed upon arrival. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bennet," Alexander replied. "I hope we might speak again." Something flickered across Clara's face then, surprise perhaps, or cautious hope, quickly suppressed. "I would not object to that, Your Grace, though I confess, I do not entirely understand why a duke would wish to continue speaking with a woman who has nothing to offer beyond honest conversation." "Perhaps," Alexander said, "that is precisely why." Clara studied him for a moment longer, as though trying to determine whether he meant the words sincerely, before offering a small nod and stepping into the waiting carriage. Alexander watched from the doorway as the modest black vehicle rolled back down the long gravel drive, disappearing eventually beyond the gates of the estate. Behind him, Eleanor's voice was quiet but knowing. "Well, Alexander, have you already decided to reject her, as you rejected the others?" He turned to face his grandmother, finding, to his own surprise, that he did not have a ready answer. For the first time in 2 years, the words came slowly, uncertainly, as though he were discovering something new about himself, even as he spoke it aloud. "No," he said finally, "I have not decided anything of the sort." Eleanor's smile, though tired, held more warmth than he had seen from her in months. "Good," she said simply. "Then perhaps there is hope for this family yet." The letter arrived at the small cottage on the edge of town 3 days later, and Clara Bennet nearly dropped the teapot when she saw the Ashbourne seal pressed into the wax. "Well," said Aunt Margaret from her chair by the window, not looking up from her needlework, "I suppose the Duke did not send you home with a polite refusal after all." Clara set the teapot down carefully before tearing open the letter, her hands trembling slightly despite her best efforts to appear composed. Margaret had raised an eyebrow at the trembling, but said nothing, choosing instead to wait until Clara had actually read the contents before offering any commentary. The letter, in Alexander's own hand rather than dictated to a secretary, requested that Clara return to Ashbourne Manor the following week to continue their acquaintance, this time accompanied by a tour of the estate and its surrounding tenant farms. It was a strange request, Clara thought, reading it twice to be certain she had understood correctly. Every account she had ever heard of courtship among the nobility involved dinners, dances, carefully staged walks through manicured gardens, not tours of tenant farms. "He wants to show me the tenant farms," she said aloud, mostly to herself. Margaret finally looked up, setting her needlework aside. "That is unusual." "It is," Clara agreed. "Perhaps he is testing you," Margaret said, "seeing whether you will complain about the smell of livestock or the state of the roads." "Perhaps," Clara said, though something in her did not entirely believe that explanation. There had been nothing calculating in Alexander's manner during their first meeting, nothing that suggested he was constructing elaborate tests to trap her into revealing some hidden flaw. If anything, he had seemed almost as uncertain as she was, answering her questions with unusual care, rather than the practiced charm she had expected from a man of his position. She wrote her acceptance that same evening, choosing her words carefully, neither too eager nor too reserved, and sent it back with the messenger who had delivered the original letter. It was only after the messenger had departed that she allowed herself to sit with the full weight of what she was doing. She was, whether she wished to admit it plainly or not, beginning to hope. It was a dangerous feeling, hope, particularly for a woman in her circumstances. Hope had a way of making disappointment sharper when it inevitably arrived, and Clara had learned through hard experience that circumstances rarely improved simply because one wished them to. And yet, sitting in the small cottage that had been her home for the past 3 years, she found herself thinking not of the Duke of Ashbourne's title or fortune, but of the way he had listened to her answers during their first meeting, genuinely listened, as though her opinions mattered to him beyond their entertainment value. The following week, Clara arrived at Ashbourne Manor dressed once again in practical clothing, this time choosing sturdy boots rather than the delicate slippers she suspected most women wore to such meetings. If Alexander intended to show her tenant farms, she reasoned, she would not embarrass herself by ruining fine shoes in the mud. Alexander met her at the entrance himself, rather than sending a servant, and something in his expression suggested he had noticed and appreciated her practical choice of footwear. "Miss Bennet," he said, "thank you for indulging what I imagine must seem an unusual request. I confess, I was curious what a duke considers a proper courtship activity," Clara admitted, as they set off across the grounds, toward the tenant farms visible in the distance. "I am not entirely certain this qualifies as courtship in the traditional sense," Alexander said, "but I find that watching how a person treats those who have no power to reward or punish them tells me a great deal more than an hour of polite conversation over tea." Clara glanced at him sideways, considering the statement. "And what did an hour of polite conversation over tea tell you?" "That you answer questions honestly, even when the honest answer is not the most flattering one," Alexander said. "But I have learned, through unfortunate experience, that honesty in a drawing room does not always translate to honesty everywhere else. Some people are quite skilled at performing sincerity when they know they are being watched." "And you believe I might be performing sincerity even now?" Clara asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. "I do not know," Alexander admitted, "which is precisely why we are walking toward a tenant farm rather than sitting in my grandmother's drawing room once again." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the manor grounds gradually giving way to open fields where tenant farmers worked the land that had supported the Hartley family for generations. As they approached the first farmhouse, a small child ran out from behind a fence, tumbling slightly in the dirt before scrambling back to her feet, tears already welling in her eyes from the fall. Before Alexander could react, Clara had already crossed the distance, kneeling down beside the child without a moment's hesitation, checking her scraped knee with gentle, practiced hands. "There now," Clara said softly. "It looks worse than it is, I promise you. A scraped knee always looks dreadful, but it heals faster than you would think." The child, no more than 5 years old, sniffled and studied Clara with wide, uncertain eyes. "Does it hurt less if someone kisses it?" she asked, in the manner of small children who have heard such remedies suggested by their mothers. Clara smiled, a genuine warm expression that Alexander had not yet seen from her. "I have heard that it does. Would you like me to try?" The child nodded, and Clara pressed a gentle kiss to the small scrape, before helping the girl to her feet, brushing the dirt from her dress with careful hands. By the time the child's mother emerged from the farmhouse, calling out apologies for her daughter's clumsiness, Clara had already coaxed a smile back onto the girl's face. "She is no trouble at all," Clara assured the mother. "Children fall. It is what they are meant to do while they learn to run properly." The mother, a tired-looking woman who could not have been much older than Clara herself, glanced nervously toward Alexander, clearly uncertain how to address the Duke standing nearby, watching the entire exchange with an unreadable expression. "Your Grace," the woman said, offering an awkward curtsy despite the child still clinging to her skirts. "I apologize for the disturbance." "There is no disturbance," Alexander said. "Miss Bennet appears to have handled the matter far more capably than I would have." The woman's eyes moved between Alexander and Clara with obvious curiosity, though she said nothing further, retreating back toward her farmhouse with a final grateful nod in Clara's direction. They continued their walk in silence for a while longer, until Alexander finally spoke. "You did not hesitate," he said. "Should I have?" Clara asked. "Most women in your position, meeting a duke for perhaps the second time in their lives, would have been more concerned with maintaining their appearance than tending to a farmer's daughter's scraped knee." Clara considered this for a moment. "I have spent most of my life around people with very little power and very little money, Your Grace. When a child is hurt, you help them. It does not occur to me to calculate what impression it might make." "That is precisely my point," Alexander said. "It did not occur to you. Which suggests it is simply who you are, rather than a performance staged for my benefit." They visited 3 more farms that afternoon, and at each one, Clara asked genuine questions about the harvest, about the condition of the cottages, about whether the families had enough to see them through the coming winter. She spoke to the tenants with the same directness she had shown Alexander during their first meeting, neither condescending nor overly familiar, simply treating each person she met as someone whose life and concerns mattered. By the time they returned to the manor as the afternoon light began to fade, Alexander found himself grappling with a realization he had not expected to reach so quickly. He had spent 2 years searching for a woman who was not performing kindness, not calculating advantage, not treating him as a means to an end, rather than a person in his own right. He had begun to believe such a woman did not exist within the circles available to him. He had not expected to find her walking through mud in sturdy boots, kneeling beside a tenant's daughter without a moment's hesitation. You are quiet, Your Grace," Clara observed as they approached the manor's entrance. "I am thinking," Alexander admitted. "About what?" He hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal, before deciding, in keeping with the honesty she had shown him, to answer truthfully. "About how thoroughly you have surprised me, Miss Bennet. I confess I arrived at today's outing, expecting to learn something useful about your character. I did not expect to enjoy your company quite so much in the process." Clara's cheeks colored slightly, though she did not look away. "I could say the same, Your Grace. I did not expect a duke to notice, let alone care, how I behaved toward people who could offer him nothing in return." "Perhaps," Alexander said, "we have both been surprised by more than we anticipated." As Clara's carriage prepared to depart later that evening, Alexander found himself standing at the entrance longer than necessary, watching until the vehicle disappeared entirely from view. Inside the manor, Eleanor watched from an upstairs window with quiet satisfaction, having observed enough of the day's proceedings through careful inquiry with the household staff, to know that her plan, against all odds and against her grandson's considerable resistance, was beginning to work exactly as she had hoped. But even as hope bloomed cautiously in Ashbourne Manor, elsewhere in London, a conversation was taking place that would soon threaten everything Alexander and Clara were only beginning to build. Lord Edmund Grayson set down his glass of brandy with more force than the moment required, the sound sharp against the polished wood of the club table. "Married," he repeated, as though the word itself tasted bitter. "To a merchant's daughter with no fortune, and no name worth mentioning. Tell me you are joking." His companion, a thin, nervous man named Percival Hughes, who made his living gathering gossip and trading it for favors among London's wealthiest families, shook his head firmly. "I have it from a maid at Ashbourne Manor herself. The Duke has taken her to see the tenant farms twice now. He never did that with any of the other 7. Edmund's jaw tightened, as Alexander's closest living cousin, and the man who stood to inherit the Ashbourne title and fortune, should Alexander die without an heir. Edmund had spent the past several years quietly, patiently, waiting for the Duke's stubborn refusal to marry, to finally exhaust his grandmother's patience entirely. Each rejected bride had brought Edmund one step closer to a future he had begun to consider inevitable, a future where the title, the estate, and the considerable Hartley fortune would eventually pass into his own hands. A merchant's daughter changed everything. If Alexander married and produced an heir, however unlikely such a match seemed on the surface, Edmund's carefully cultivated patience would have been for nothing. "What do you know of her?" Edmund asked. "Little enough," Percival admitted. "Clara Bennet. Father was a merchant, lost his fortune before he died. She has been working as a companion these past years, caring for an aunt in a small cottage outside the city. No scandal that I could find, which is disappointing, given how useful a scandal might prove." "No scandal at all?" Edmund pressed. "Everyone has something, Hughes. You simply have not looked hard enough." "I have looked considerably harder than my usual efforts warrant, given the coin you have paid me for it," Percival said, a note of defensiveness entering his voice. "But if there is something to find, it is buried deeper than my usual sources can reach." Edmund sat back in his chair, considering the problem with the same careful calculation he applied to every obstacle in his path. He had not survived years of financial difficulty and social maneuvering by giving up at the first sign of resistance. If Clara Bennet's past held no convenient scandal, then perhaps one would need to be constructed rather than discovered. "Keep looking," Edmund said finally. "Everyone has a weakness, Hughes, a debt unpaid, a family member with an unfortunate reputation, a rejected suitor nursing a grudge. Find hers, or manufacture something close enough to the truth that it cannot easily be disproven." Percival hesitated. "The Duke is not a fool, my lord. If it becomes known that the scandal was fabricated, then we shall ensure it does not become known," Edmund said sharply. "I did not ask for your opinion on the risks involved, Hughes. I asked for results. You will be compensated accordingly for either outcome." As Percival departed to continue his inquiries, Edmund remained at the club long after the other members had retired for the evening, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace, with the particular focus of a man who had convinced himself, through years of careful self-justification, that what he wanted, and what was right, were one and the same thing. Meanwhile, at Ashbourne Manor, the relationship between Alexander and Clara continued to deepen, in ways neither of them had entirely anticipated. Their third meeting took place not in the formal drawing room, but in the estate's expansive library, where Alexander had discovered, quite by accident during their previous conversation, that Clara shared his fondness for reading. She arrived that afternoon to find him waiting among the towering shelves, several books already selected and set aside on a nearby table. "I confess I do not entirely know what qualifies as an appropriate courtship activity in a library," Alexander admitted, "but I thought you might enjoy seeing the collection regardless." Clara's eyes moved across the shelves with visible delight, the practiced composure she usually maintained slipping slightly at the sight of so many books gathered in one place. "This is remarkable, Your Grace. I have not seen a collection this extensive since my father's business began to fail. We were forced to sell most of our library to cover his debts." "That must have been difficult," Alexander said, watching her carefully. "It was," Clara admitted, running her fingers gently along the spines of the nearest shelf. "Books were the one luxury my father never denied me, even when money grew scarce. Losing them felt, in some ways, like losing him twice." The honesty of the admission, offered without any apparent expectation of sympathy, struck Alexander deeply. He had grown so accustomed to women performing vulnerability for effect, carefully calculated to elicit exactly the right response, that Clara's genuine openness continued to catch him off guard, even now, on their third meeting. "You may borrow whatever you like," he said. "For as long as you like." Clara turned to look at him, surprise evident in her expression. "That is a generous offer, Your Grace." "It is a small offer," Alexander corrected. "Books were meant to be read, not simply displayed on shelves for visitors to admire. I have far too many that have never been opened." They spent the following hours moving through the library together, Alexander pulling volumes from shelves he had not visited in years, Clara examining each one with genuine curiosity rather than polite disinterest. She asked questions about his own reading preferences, laughed genuinely when he admitted to a fondness for adventure novels he considered beneath his dignity to discuss in most company, and offered opinions on literature with the same directness she brought to every other conversation. "You are different when you speak of books," Clara observed at one point, watching him animatedly describe a particular volume of poetry he had discovered during his university years. Different how? Less guarded, Clara said. As though you have forgotten, for a moment, that you are supposed to be careful about what you reveal. Alexander paused, considering the observation. I suppose I have spent so long being cautious around people who wanted something from me, that I have forgotten what it feels like to simply enjoy a conversation, without calculating its consequences. And do you feel that way now? Clara asked, her voice quieter than before. He met her gaze directly, something shifting in the air between them, that neither seemed entirely prepared to name aloud. I believe I do, Miss Bennet. The moment stretched between them, charged with an unfamiliar tension that had nothing to do with courtship rituals or family obligations, and everything to do with two people slowly, cautiously recognizing something genuine beginning to grow between them. Clara looked away first, returning her attention to the book in her hands, though a faint smile lingered at the corners of her mouth. I should not have said that, Alexander added quickly, worried he had overstepped some invisible boundary. No, Clara said. I am glad you did. They continued their conversation through the remainder of the afternoon, the earlier tension settling into something warmer, more comfortable, as they moved from discussing literature to discussing their respective childhoods, their fears, their hopes for the future. Clara spoke of her father's kindness, despite his poor business decisions, of the years spent caring for her aunt without complaint, of her quiet determination to build a life of meaning, regardless of the circumstances she had been dealt. Alexander, in turn, found himself sharing details he had never offered any previous bride. His own difficult relationship with his late father, a man who had valued title and appearance above genuine connection, and his fear, carried silently for years, that he might inherit the same coldness that had defined his father's approach to marriage and family. You are nothing like that, Clara said, when he finally admitted this fear aloud. A man who feared becoming his father would not spend 2 years refusing to marry, simply for the sake of convenience. He would have married the first suitable woman presented to him, and called it duty. You refused precisely because you did not want to repeat his mistakes. Alexander studied her for a long moment, struck once again by how effortlessly she understood things about him that he had struggled to articulate even to himself. How is it, he asked quietly, that a woman I have known for less than 2 weeks understands me better than most people who have known me for years? Clara smiled, a soft, genuine expression that had become increasingly familiar over the course of the afternoon. Perhaps, Your Grace, it is simply because I am not trying to see what I want to see. I am only trying to see you as you actually are. As the afternoon light finally began to fade, signaling the end of another visit, Alexander walked Clara to her waiting carriage, with a reluctance he made no effort to hide. Until next time, Miss Bennet, he said. Until next time, Your Grace, Clara replied, though something in her expression suggested she, too, was already anticipating their next meeting, with more eagerness than she might have admitted aloud. Neither of them knew, as the carriage rolled away down the long gravel drive, that in London, Lord Edmund Grayson had already begun laying the groundwork for a scheme designed to ensure there would be no further meetings between them at all. The knock at the cottage door came just after dusk, sharp and insistent, startling Clara from the letter she had been writing by candlelight. She opened the door to find a young man she did not recognize, his clothing suggesting he served in some wealthy household, though not one she could immediately place. He held out a folded note without a word of introduction, then disappeared back into the darkening street before Clara could ask his purpose. The note contained no signature, only a warning written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Someone is asking questions about your father's debts, and about the true reasons your family's business collapsed. If you value the Duke's good opinion, you would do well to learn what is being said before it reaches him first. Clara read the note 3 times, her hands growing colder with each reading, though the evening held no particular chill. Her father's business had failed through poor decisions and misplaced trust, nothing more scandalous than that, as far as she had ever known. But the deliberate vagueness of the warning suggested someone intended to twist that ordinary misfortune into something far more damaging. What is it? Margaret asked from her chair by the fire, noticing Clara's stricken expression. I do not know, Clara admitted, handing over the note. But I do not like it. Margaret read the note carefully, her expression growing troubled. Someone wishes you harm, it seems, or wishes to harm your chances with the Duke, which amounts to much the same thing, given the circumstances. But there is nothing to find, Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, a small, uncomfortable memory surfaced from years long past. A memory she had buried so deeply, she rarely allowed herself to consider it at all. At least, nothing beyond what everyone already knows. Margaret studied her niece carefully. Clara. It is nothing, Clara said quickly, perhaps too quickly. A private matter, long resolved. It has nothing to do with the Duke, nor with anything currently happening. But the seed of worry had already been planted, and Clara found herself unable to sleep that night, turning the anonymous warning over and over in her mind, wondering who might wish to see her separated from Alexander, and why. The following morning brought clarity, though not the kind Clara had hoped for. A visit from an unexpected source arrived just after breakfast, a woman Clara vaguely recognized from her years working as a companion in London, a former acquaintance named Beatrice Colton, who had once served in the same household as Clara, before their paths diverged entirely. Clara, Beatrice said, settling into the small parlor, with an expression that suggested she was enjoying the visit considerably more than the circumstances warranted. I heard the most extraordinary rumor, that you have been visiting Ashbourne Manor, that the Duke himself has taken an interest in you. Word travels quickly, Clara said carefully, unwilling to confirm or deny anything to a woman she had never fully trusted, even during their previous acquaintance. It does, particularly when the story is this delicious, Beatrice said, a knowing smile playing at her lips. A merchant's daughter, catching the eye of one of England's most eligible dukes. Society will have quite a lot to say about it, I imagine, once the news spreads more widely. There is nothing official to spread, Clara said. We have met a handful of times, nothing more. Of course, Beatrice said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe the modest description. Though I do wonder, Clara, whether you have told him everything. About your father, I mean. About the true circumstances of his business collapsing. Clara felt her stomach tighten, the anonymous warning from the previous evening suddenly taking clearer shape. What are you suggesting, Beatrice? Nothing at all, Beatrice said, her expression the picture of innocent concern, though something calculating lingered beneath the surface. Only that dukes tend to value complete honesty from those they consider marrying. I would hate for old, unfortunate matters to resurface at an inconvenient moment, simply because they had been left unspoken. After Beatrice departed, leaving behind an unmistakable air of threat, disguised as friendly concern, Clara sat alone in the parlor for a long while, wrestling with a decision she had hoped never to face. The truth about her father's business collapse was more complicated than she had ever admitted to anyone outside her immediate family. Her father had not simply lost his fortune through poor decisions, as she had told Alexander during their first meeting. In the final years before his death, desperate to recover the family's declining fortunes, he had entered into a business arrangement that had ultimately proven fraudulent, though he himself had been deceived rather than complicit in the deception. When the fraud was eventually uncovered, several investors had lost significant sums of money, and though her father had been cleared of any wrongdoing after a lengthy investigation, the scandal had followed the Bennet family name for years afterward, quietly whispered about in circles Clara had long since left behind. She had not lied to Alexander, precisely. She had simply omitted the more complicated, painful details, choosing instead the simpler explanation that her father had lost his fortune through poor decisions, which was, in its own way, true, even if it was not the complete truth. Now, faced with the possibility that someone intended to reveal the fuller story in a manner designed to cast suspicion on her family's honesty, Clara understood she faced a difficult choice. She could wait, hoping the threat would never materialize, or she could return to Ashbourne Manor and tell Alexander everything herself, before someone else had the opportunity to distort the story into something far more damaging than the truth actually warranted. She chose the latter, though the decision cost her considerable sleep and no small measure of fear. She arrived at Ashbourne Manor the following afternoon, without prior notice, a departure from their usual arranged meetings that immediately signaled to Alexander, upon seeing her troubled expression, that something serious had occurred. "Clara," he said, meeting her in the entrance hall himself, "what has happened?" "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Something I should have told you during our first conversation, rather than allowing you to learn a distorted version from someone else." They retreated to the privacy of his study, and there, with the same directness that had characterized every previous conversation between them, Clara told Alexander the complete truth about her father's business collapse, the fraudulent investment scheme he had unknowingly entered, the investors who had lost money, the lengthy investigation that had eventually cleared her father's name, but never fully erased the whispered suspicions that lingered in certain circles. "I did not lie to you precisely," Clara said, once she had finished the difficult explanation. "But I did not tell you everything either, and I understand if that omission changes how you view me." Alexander listened without interruption, his expression difficult to read as the story unfolded. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and Clara found herself bracing for the rejection she feared was coming. "Why are you telling me this now?" he finally asked. "Because someone came to warn me that others intend to reveal it themselves, in whatever form causes the most damage," Clara said. "I would rather you hear the truth from me than a distortion from someone with reasons of their own to see us separated." "Who came to warn you?" "An anonymous note, and a visit from a woman I once knew, who seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding me of the story's existence," Clara said. "I do not know who is behind it, but someone clearly wishes to see this courtship end before it has properly begun." Alexander's expression darkened, though not, Clara realized with considerable relief, in a manner directed at her. "This has the distinct feeling of my cousin Edmund's handiwork," he said slowly. "He stands to inherit everything, should I die without an heir, and he has grown increasingly anxious with each passing week that this courtship might actually succeed where the previous 7 failed." "You do not seem surprised," Clara observed. "I am not," Alexander admitted. "Edmund has never been subtle about his hopes for my continued bachelorhood, though I confess I did not expect him to act on those hopes quite so directly." He paused, studying Clara carefully. "Thank you for telling me the truth yourself, rather than waiting to see whether the threat would materialize." "You are not angry?" Clara asked, genuine surprise evident in her voice. "Your father was deceived by dishonest men, Clara. That is not a crime you need to answer for, nor one your father needed to answer for either, given that the investigation cleared his name. I am considerably more troubled by whoever is threatening you than by anything you have just told me." Relief flooded through Clara so completely that she found herself briefly unable to speak, the tension she had carried since the previous evening finally beginning to ease. "I was certain you would see me differently," she admitted quietly. "I do see you differently," Alexander said. "I see a woman who chose to tell me an uncomfortable truth, rather than allow someone else to weaponize it against her. That does not diminish my opinion of you, Clara. If anything, it strengthens it considerably." Something warm and unfamiliar settled in Clara's chest at his words, a feeling she had not allowed herself to fully name until that moment, standing together in his study, with the afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. But even as relief and something deeper began to bloom between them, both understood that whoever had orchestrated the threat would not simply abandon their efforts after one failed attempt. If Edmund Grayson was indeed responsible, as Alexander suspected, he would not rest until he had found a way to separate them permanently, and the coming weeks would test their fragile, growing connection in ways neither of them could yet fully anticipate. Percival Hughes arrived at Lord Edmund Grayson's townhouse in a state of visible agitation, refusing to sit even when offered a chair, pacing instead before the unlit fireplace with nervous, hurried steps. "She told him," Percival said, before Edmund had even finished pouring his morning drink. "Clara Bennett went to Ashbourne Manor yesterday and told the Duke everything herself. Beatrice Colton's visit clearly frightened her into confessing before we could arrange for the story to reach him through less favorable channels." Edmund's hand tightened around his glass, though his expression remained carefully controlled. "And how did the Duke respond?" "According to my source in the household, he did not respond with anger at all," Percival said. "If anything, the servants say his affection for her seems to have deepened rather than diminished. He apparently considers her honesty a mark in her favor rather than a scandal to be feared." Edmund set down his glass with deliberate care, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed his frustration. "Then we shall need a more direct approach. My lord, I would counsel caution," Percival said. "The Duke is not a fool." If he suspects deliberate interference in his courtship and traces it back to you, the consequences could prove considerably worse than simply losing the inheritance you currently hope to gain. I did not ask for caution, Hughes, Edmund said sharply. I asked for results. And if honest disclosure has failed to end this courtship, then perhaps a scandal of an entirely different nature is required, one that cannot be so easily explained away with a confession and a sympathetic ear. Over the following days, Edmund set his plan into motion with the same careful calculation he had applied to every previous scheme in his life. He understood, from years of observing London society, that reputation mattered more than truth in the circles that governed acceptable marriages, and that a sufficiently damaging rumor, deployed at precisely the right moment, could destroy a courtship even without a single fact to support it. He began by cultivating a relationship with a minor gossip columnist who wrote for one of London's more scandalous publications, offering carefully worded suggestions about an unnamed duke's courtship with a woman of questionable background, hinting at improprieties that had never actually occurred, but which, once printed, would be nearly impossible to fully disprove. The article appeared 3 days later, carefully vague enough to avoid direct accusations of libel, but specific enough that anyone familiar with recent society gossip would immediately understand its subject. It suggested that a certain unnamed duke had been deceived by a fortune-seeking woman who had fabricated her entire history, including the circumstances of her father's business failure, in order to secure a marriage far above her actual station. Clara learned of the article from her aunt, who had heard it discussed by a neighbor returning from the market that same morning. The story already spreading through whispered conversations across the city with the particular speed reserved for scandal. "They are saying you lied to him," Margaret said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger as she read the article aloud to Clara. "That you fabricated your entire story to trap him into marriage." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her. The careful honesty she had offered Alexander now twisted into precisely the opposite narrative by unknown hands, determined to see her ruined. "This is not true," she said. "Every word I told him was true." "I know that," Margaret said firmly. "But knowing the truth and stopping a rumor from spreading are two entirely different matters, my dear. Once a story like this begins circulating, it takes on a life of its own, regardless of the facts." Clara spent the remainder of the day in a state of mounting distress, uncertain whether to remain in the safety of the cottage or venture out to face whatever whispers awaited her, uncertain whether Alexander himself had already heard the article and begun to doubt everything she had told him during their previous conversation. She need not have worried, though she would not learn this until later that evening. At Ashbourne Manor, Alexander had indeed heard of the article within hours of its publication, delivered to him by a concerned member of his staff who feared he might be blindsided by the scandal at some public gathering. He read the piece twice, his anger building with each careful, calculated word, before setting the paper aside and calling for his carriage without a moment's further hesitation. He arrived at Clara's cottage just as darkness was settling over the small town, his expression fierce enough that Margaret, answering the door, stepped aside without a word, allowing him entrance without the formality that usually accompanied such visits. "Clara," Alexander said, finding her in the small parlor, her expression already braced for whatever accusation she assumed he had come to deliver. "I have read the article." "I did not lie to you," Clara said immediately, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "Every word I told you about my father was true, Your Grace. I swear it." "I know," Alexander said, and the simplicity of his answer caught Clara entirely off guard. "You know?" she repeated. "I have never doubted you for a moment," Alexander said, crossing the room to stand before her. "The article is precisely the kind of vague, calculated cruelty I would expect from someone determined to see this courtship fail, without any regard for what is actually true. I have already begun making inquiries into its source, and I have little doubt it will lead back to my cousin Edmund." Relief broke across Clara's face, though it was quickly followed by a fresh wave of concern. "But the story is already spreading, Your Grace. Regardless of whether it is true, people will believe what they wish to believe. This could damage your reputation as much as mine." "Let it damage my reputation then," Alexander said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I would rather stand publicly beside a woman of genuine honesty and face whatever gossip results than abandon her to protect a reputation built on the approval of people willing to believe baseless rumors over demonstrated character. Clara stared at him, something in her chest tightening with an emotion too large and unfamiliar to easily name. "You would risk your own standing for my sake?" "Clara," Alexander said quietly, "I have spent 2 years rejecting women who offered me nothing but performance and calculation. You have offered me nothing but honesty since the moment we met, even when that honesty came at considerable cost to yourself. I would be a poor excuse for a man, let alone a duke, if I abandoned you now, simply because someone else has decided to weaponize a lie against us." The words settled between them with a weight that neither had quite anticipated, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The small parlor filled with something that felt, to Clara at least, remarkably close to the beginning of genuine love, however cautiously either of them might have named it aloud. "What will you do?" Clara finally asked. "I intend to confront Edmund directly," Alexander said, "and I intend to make a public statement clarifying the truth of your father's circumstances, supported by the official record of the investigation that cleared his name. I will not allow a vague, anonymous accusation to define your reputation when the actual truth is readily available to anyone willing to examine it honestly." Over the following days, Alexander proved as good as his word. He obtained copies of the official investigation records that had cleared Clara's father of any wrongdoing years earlier, arranged for these records to be shared discreetly with several influential members of society, known for their fairness rather than their appetite for gossip, and personally confronted Edmund at their family's shared club, though his cousin denied any involvement with practiced, unconvincing innocence. "I have no idea what you are suggesting, Alexander," Edmund said, his expression carefully arranged into wounded surprise. "Why would I concern myself with your courtship at all?" "Because you stand to inherit everything, should I remain unmarried," Alexander said flatly. "And because the timing of this article, appearing precisely when my courtship with Miss Bennet began deepening into something serious, strains credulity, beyond reasonable coincidence." "You have no proof of any such connection," Edmund said. "Not yet," Alexander agreed. "But I intend to find it, Edmund, and when I do, you should understand clearly that whatever inheritance you currently hope to gain through my failure to marry will be the least of your concerns." Edmund's composure cracked slightly at the warning, though he recovered quickly enough, offering a final, unconvincing denial before departing the club with considerably less confidence than he had arrived with. Alexander returned to Ashbourne Manor that evening with a grim determination settling over him, understanding, even as he had defended Clara publicly and privately, that Edmund would not simply abandon his scheme after a single confrontation. The article had already done considerable damage to Clara's reputation, regardless of the truth eventually emerging, and Alexander suspected, correctly, that his cousin's efforts to separate them had only just begun. Dowager Duchess Eleanor Hartley's condition worsened considerably over the following week, a decline the physicians attributed partly to natural progression of her illness, and partly, though no one said it aloud, to the stress of watching the scandal unfold around the courtship she had so carefully orchestrated. Clara arrived at Ashbourne Manor to find the household in quiet distress, servants moving through the halls with hushed voices, and Alexander himself looking more exhausted than she had ever seen him, dark circles evident beneath his eyes from what she suspected were sleepless nights spent at his grandmother's bedside. "How is she?" Clara asked, finding Alexander in the hallway outside Eleanor's chamber. "Weaker," Alexander admitted, his usual composure cracking slightly beneath the weight of the past several days. "The physician says it may simply be the natural progression of her illness, but I cannot help wondering whether this entire ordeal with Edmund has hastened matters." "May I see her?" Clara asked. Alexander studied her for a moment before nodding, leading her into the chamber where Eleanor lay propped against several pillows, her face pale, but her eyes still sharp and alert despite her evident frailty. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice weaker than during their previous meetings, but still carrying the same firm warmth. "I had wondered whether you would still come, given everything that has been said about you in the papers." "I would not abandon you, Your Grace," Clara said, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Nor would I abandon Alexander, regardless of what lies others choose to spread." Eleanor's expression softened. "I chose well, it seems," she said quietly, "though I confess, I did not anticipate quite this much difficulty in the process. None of us did, Alexander said, taking a seat on the opposite side of the bed. They spoke for a while of ordinary matters, Eleanor asking after Clara's aunt, inquiring about the state of the tenant farms Clara had visited during her previous outings with Alexander, and gradually, as the conversation continued, something in the room's atmosphere shifted from anxious tension toward a quieter, more hopeful warmth. "I want to see you married before I am gone," Eleanor said eventually, her voice growing softer, as fatigue began to settle over her more heavily. "Not out of obligation, nor out of fear for the family's future. I want to see the two of you happy, in whatever time remains to me." "Grandmother," Alexander began, but Eleanor raised a weak hand, silencing him gently. "I am not asking you to rush into marriage for my sake alone," she said. "I am simply telling you what would bring me genuine peace, should the physicians prove correct about the limited time remaining. But the decision, of course, remains entirely yours." After Eleanor drifted into a restless sleep, Alexander and Clara withdrew to the quiet of the manor's private gardens, walking together in silence for a while, as the events of recent days settled heavily between them. "I have been thinking about what she said," Alexander finally admitted, as they paused beside a small fountain at the garden's center. "About marriage?" Clara asked. "About happiness," Alexander said. "I spent 2 years believing that finding the right person meant finding someone who felt nothing calculated, nothing performed. I found that in you, Clara, almost from our very first conversation, and yet I have hesitated to speak plainly about what I actually feel, perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of fear, that speaking it aloud would somehow make it less real." Clara's breath caught slightly at the direction of the conversation, though she said nothing, allowing him to continue. "I love you," Alexander said simply, the words carrying none of the practiced elegance that might have accompanied such a declaration from another man, but all the more powerful for their unadorned honesty. "I did not expect to find it here, in a woman my grandmother chose without my consent. In circumstances I resisted at every turn. But I love you nonetheless, Clara, and I have not been entirely honest with myself about how deeply, until this moment." Clara felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, though they were tears of a kind she had not experienced in years, born not of grief or hardship, but of something far gentler and more precious. "I love you as well," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have loved you, I think, since the day you defended me without hesitation, after the article appeared, though I did not allow myself to name it so clearly until just now." They stood together beside the fountain, as the afternoon light softened around them, the weight of recent scandal and worry momentarily forgotten in the quiet, honest exchange between two people who had, against every expectation either had carried into their first meeting, found precisely what neither had believed themselves capable of finding. "I want to marry you, Clara," Alexander said, "not because my grandmother wishes it, not because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine building a life with anyone else." "And I want to marry you," Clara said, "though I understand that saying yes means accepting whatever scandal Edmund and his allies continue to manufacture against us." "Let them manufacture whatever scandal they wish," Alexander said, echoing the same fierce determination he had shown when first learning of the newspaper article. "I would rather face a lifetime of whispered rumors beside you than a lifetime of comfortable silence beside anyone else." They returned to the manor that evening, with a quiet joy that neither could fully contain, and when they shared the news with Eleanor, upon waking her gently from her rest, the old woman's face broke into an expression of pure, unguarded happiness that neither Alexander nor Clara had witnessed since the beginning of her illness. "I knew it," Eleanor said, her weak voice, nonetheless, carrying genuine triumph. "I knew the moment I saw the two of you together in that drawing room that I had finally chosen correctly." But even as joy settled over Ashbourne Manor for the first time in weeks, word of the engagement reached Edmund Grayson within days, delivered by an anxious Percival Hughes who understood, better than anyone, precisely how thoroughly this development threatened his employer's carefully cultivated inheritance. "An engagement," Edmund repeated, his voice tight with barely restrained fury as he absorbed the news. "Despite the article, despite everything we have done to separate them. The Duke seems entirely unmoved by public opinion, where Miss Bennet is concerned," Percival admitted. "If anything, the scandal appears to have strengthened his resolve rather than weakened it. Edmund's hands clenched into fists at his sides, the calm composure he usually maintained finally beginning to crack under the mounting pressure of his failing schemes. "Then we shall need to ensure the wedding never actually takes place," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Whatever the cost, Hughes. Whatever it takes." "My lord," Percival said carefully, "I must once again urge caution. Escalating this further risks." "I did not ask for your opinion," Edmund snapped, cutting him off entirely. "I asked for a solution. Find me something that will end this engagement permanently, or find yourself another employer entirely, because I have no further use for a man who offers only warnings without results." As Percival departed to consider his next move, Edmund remained alone in his study, staring into the empty fireplace with an expression that had shifted, over the course of recent weeks, from calculated ambition into something considerably darker and more desperate. A transformation that neither Alexander nor Clara yet fully understood the danger of, even as they celebrated an engagement that Edmund had already privately vowed would never reach its intended conclusion. The letters arrived at the offices of London's most widely read gossip publication, exactly 1 week before the wedding was scheduled to take place, delivered by an anonymous messenger who vanished into the crowded streets before anyone could question him. They purported to be written by Clara herself, addressed to an unnamed gentleman, filled with intimate suggestions that she had continued meeting him secretly, even after her engagement to the Duke of Ashbourne had been announced, apparently for financial gain that had nothing to do with genuine affection. The publication, eager for another scandal involving the already controversial courtship, printed excerpts within days, and by the time Clara learned of their existence, half of London society had already begun whispering that the merchant's daughter who had captured a duke's heart was, in truth, nothing more than a calculating fraud after all. "They are forgeries," Clara said, her voice shaking with a fury she had rarely allowed herself to express, as she stared at the printed excerpts Alexander had brought to her that morning. "I have never written a single word of this. I do not even recognize the handwriting as anything close to my own." "I know," Alexander said, his own anger barely contained beneath a carefully controlled exterior. "The handwriting is close enough to yours to convince someone unfamiliar with your actual writing, but it lacks the particular way you form certain letters. I noticed the difference immediately. But will society notice the same difference?" Clara asked. "Or will they simply believe what they wish to believe, as Margaret warned they might?" The question hung heavily between them, neither able to offer a confident answer. The previous scandal, however damaging, had at least been rooted in a distortion of true events. This new scheme was constructed entirely from fabrication, and fabrication, they both understood, could be considerably harder to disprove than a distorted truth, particularly when the person crafting the lie had taken care to make it plausible. Word of the forged letters reached Eleanor's sickbed within hours, and though her physician had cautioned against excitement of any kind, the old woman insisted on being informed of every development, refusing to be shielded from a crisis threatening the future she had worked so hard to secure for her grandson. "This is Edmund's doing," Eleanor said firmly, once Alexander had explained the situation. "It has his particular flavor of desperation. He has grown reckless, which suggests he understands his previous efforts have failed entirely. Reckless enough to forge letters and distribute them publicly," Alexander said grimly. "I fear what he might attempt next, if even this fails to separate us." Meanwhile, in his own townhouse, Percival Hughes found himself wrestling with a conscience he had spent years successfully ignoring, in service of steady employment and reliable coin. The forged letters had been his own creation, commissioned by Edmund, with explicit instructions to make them as damaging and convincing as possible, and though he had completed the task competently, the growing scale of the deception had begun to trouble him in ways his previous, smaller schemes never had. He had gathered gossip for wealthy clients for years, traded in secrets and rumors that occasionally damaged reputations, but he had never before been asked to fabricate evidence entirely from nothing, evidence that could permanently destroy an innocent woman's future and reputation, based purely on a desperate man's greed. That evening, as Edmund celebrated the letter's publication with considerable satisfaction, Percival made a decision that would ultimately determine the fate of everyone involved. He traveled to Ashbourne Manor under cover of darkness, requesting an audience with the Duke himself, and when Alexander received him, wary and suspicious given the man's known association with his cousin, Percival laid out the entire truth without hesitation, driven by a guilt he could no longer comfortably suppress. "I wrote the letters," Percival admitted, his voice unsteady. "At Lord Grayson's explicit direction. I studied Miss Bennet's handwriting, from an old letter he had somehow acquired, and I did my best to replicate it convincingly. I also arranged the initial newspaper article regarding her father's business dealings, though I confess I regret both actions considerably." Alexander listened with a controlled fury that Percival found more unsettling than open anger might have been. "And you are telling me this now because I am not a man who takes pleasure in destroying an innocent woman's future. Your Grace, whatever my previous willingness to trade in gossip and rumor for profit," Percival said, "Lord Grayson's schemes have grown increasingly desperate and increasingly cruel, and I find I can no longer participate in them, regardless of the coin offered for my continued silence." "Will you testify to this publicly?" Alexander asked. "Will you provide written confirmation of Edmund's involvement, in a form that can be presented to the very publication that printed these forgeries?" Percival hesitated, understanding the personal risk such a confession would carry, given Edmund's considerable influence and the enemies he might make among those who valued discretion in London's gossip circles. "I will," he said finally. "I have taken enough from Lord Grayson's schemes already, Your Grace. I would rather face whatever consequences follow honest confession than continue living with the weight of what I have already done." The following morning, armed with Percival's detailed written confession and samples of Clara's genuine handwriting for comparison, Alexander requested an urgent meeting with the editor of the publication that had printed the forged letters, presenting evidence so thorough and convincing that the editor agreed, within hours, to print a full retraction along with Percival's confession, detailing Edmund's involvement in both schemes. The retraction appeared the following day, and its effect on London society proved swift and dramatic. Where whispers of Clara's supposed deception had spread rapidly through fashionable drawing rooms, the revelation of Edmund's deliberate scheme to destroy an innocent woman's reputation for his own financial gain spread even faster, transforming public sentiment almost overnight from suspicion toward Clara into outrage toward Edmund. Edmund himself learned of the retraction and Percival's betrayal while dining at his club, the news delivered by a fellow member who took considerable, unmasked pleasure in sharing the details of his humiliating downfall. "Traitorous coward," Edmund muttered, abandoning his half-finished meal and storming from the club in a fury that drew the attention of every other member present, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. He arrived at Ashbourne Manor that same evening, uninvited and clearly unwelcome, demanding an audience with Alexander, despite the household staff's attempts to turn him away. "You have ruined me," Edmund said, storming into Alexander's study without waiting for permission to enter. "Do you understand what you have done? Every door in London will be closed to me now. Every family that once considered an alliance with our name will turn away in disgust." "I have ruined nothing, Edmund," Alexander said, his voice cold and controlled, despite the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "You ruined yourself, the moment you decided to forge letters and destroy an innocent woman's reputation, simply because you could not accept that I had finally found happiness." "Happiness?" Edmund spat, the word dripping with contempt. "You mean fortune. You mean the inheritance I have waited years to claim, an inheritance that would have been mine had you simply continued rejecting every bride, as you did before this merchant's daughter arrived, to seduce you with false modesty and manufactured honesty." "Clara has manufactured nothing," Alexander said, his voice rising for the first time. "Everything she has told me, from the very first conversation we shared, has been true. You are the one who has spent months constructing lies, manipulating gossip columnists, forging documents, all in service of an inheritance you were never guaranteed in the first place." Edmund's composure finally shattered entirely, years of carefully controlled ambition collapsing into raw, unguarded desperation. "I have spent my entire life in your shadow, Alexander, watching you inherit everything simply by virtue of birth, while I scraped together whatever modest fortune I could manage on my own. Is it truly so unreasonable that I hoped, eventually, for something to finally come to me?" "It is not unreasonable to hope for a better future, Edmund," Alexander said, some of his anger softening slightly at the raw honesty behind his cousin's outburst. "It is unreasonable and unforgivable to attempt to steal that future by destroying an innocent woman's reputation and happiness. Whatever grievances you carry against the circumstances of our births, Clara bears no responsibility for them, and she should never have been made to suffer for your resentment. Edmund said nothing further, the fight finally draining from his expression as the full weight of his exposed schemes settled over him. He left Ashbourne Manor that evening without another word, and within days, word spread that he had departed London entirely, retreating to a distant property to wait out the scandal that now attached firmly to his own name. His hopes of inheriting the Ashbourne title and fortune, permanently extinguished by his own reckless desperation. At the manor, Alexander returned to Clara that same evening, finding her in the drawing room where she had waited anxiously throughout the confrontation, uncertain what news he might bring. "It is over," he said simply, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Edmund has been exposed. Percival confessed everything, and the truth has been printed for all of London to see. Whatever doubt remained about your character has been thoroughly dispelled." Clara's relief broke across her face, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, tears finally falling freely after weeks of carefully maintained composure. "It is truly over. It is truly over," Alexander confirmed, drawing her gently into an embrace. "Nothing stands between us any longer, Clara. Nothing but the wedding we have already planned, and the life we intend to build together." News of Edmund's exposed schemes and Percival's public confession spread through London society with remarkable speed, and in the days that followed, Clara found herself experiencing something she had never anticipated, after weeks of enduring whispered rumors and printed accusations. Genuine, widespread sympathy. Invitations began arriving at the small cottage that had once seemed too modest for any fashionable attention, from families who had previously dismissed her as an unsuitable match for a duke, now eager to demonstrate their support for a woman who had been so thoroughly wronged by a jealous relative's desperate schemes. Clara accepted few of these invitations, understanding them for what they largely were, an attempt by society to align itself with the winning side of a story that had captured everyone's attention for weeks. But some gestures of support felt genuine, and among these was an unexpected visit from Beatrice Colton, the same woman who had once visited Clara with thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly concern. "I owe you an apology," Beatrice said, arriving at the cottage with a nervousness Clara had never previously witnessed from her. "I did not know, when I visited you those weeks ago, precisely how far Lord Grayson intended to take his scheme. He had approached me with a modest sum, asking me to plant seeds of doubt about your character, and I confess I agreed without fully considering the harm it might cause." Clara studied her former acquaintance for a long moment, weighing forgiveness against the genuine hurt Beatrice's visit had caused during an already difficult time. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because watching the full scope of what Lord Grayson attempted has shown me clearly what I allowed myself to become a part of," Beatrice said. "I am not asking for your friendship, Clara. I am simply asking for your understanding, and offering my genuine apology for whatever role I played in your suffering." Clara considered the apology carefully before responding. "I appreciate your honesty, Beatrice, difficult as it must have been to offer it. I cannot promise our friendship will return to what it once was, but I do not hold grudges against those brave enough to admit their mistakes honestly." After Beatrice's departure, Clara found herself reflecting on how thoroughly her circumstances had transformed over the preceding weeks, from a woman viewed with suspicion and scandal, to one now regarded, however belatedly, with genuine sympathy and respect. The transformation felt strange, almost disorienting, though she understood that the true measure of her character had never actually changed throughout the entire ordeal. Only society's perception of her had shifted, swinging from unfair suspicion toward equally sudden approval, neither extreme entirely reflecting the steady, quiet person she had always been. At Ashbourne Manor, preparations for the wedding continued with renewed energy, Eleanor insisting on personally overseeing many of the details despite her physician's continued warnings about overexertion. "I have waited too long for this day, Alexander," Eleanor said, when he gently suggested she rest rather than exhaust herself with wedding preparations. "I intend to see it arrive properly, and I intend to enjoy every moment of the planning, regardless of what my physician believes is wise." Alexander did not argue further, understanding that his grandmother's determination to see the wedding through to its conclusion had become, in many ways, the driving force keeping her spirits high despite her declining health. She spent hours discussing flower arrangements with Clara, selecting fabrics for the wedding dress, with an enthusiasm that reminded Alexander of stories he had heard about her own youth, before age and responsibility had settled more heavily upon her. "You have made her happier than I have seen her in years," Alexander told Clara one afternoon, watching his grandmother animatedly discuss seating arrangements with the household staff from her favored chair near the window. "She has given me something I never expected to find," Clara replied. "A family, Alexander, not simply a title or a fortune, but genuine people who care for me as I am, rather than for what I might offer them." Their wedding preparations continued through the following weeks, with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the earlier weeks of scandal and threat. And slowly, gradually, the household at Ashbourne Manor began to feel less like a place recovering from crisis, and more like a home preparing joyfully for a new beginning. Clara's Aunt Margaret arrived to stay at the manor as the wedding date approached, her sharp observations providing frequent, welcome amusement during the more tense moments of planning. "I confess, I did not expect, when you first told me about that letter from the Dowager Duchess, that we would end up here," Margaret admitted one evening, watching Clara try on her wedding dress for a final fitting. "I expected disappointment, Clara. I expected another failed courtship, another young woman's heart, broken by a duke, too proud to see what stood before him." "I expected much the same," Clara admitted, studying her reflection in the mirror with an expression of quiet wonder. "I certainly never expected to find genuine love, Aunt Margaret. Not with a duke, not with anyone, given how modest our circumstances had become. And yet here you are," Margaret said, her voice softening with genuine affection, rarely displayed so openly. "Your father would be proud, Clara. Whatever difficulties he faced in his final years, he raised a daughter, capable of finding happiness, even amid considerable hardship. That is no small achievement." The mention of her father brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes, though they were tears born of gratitude rather than grief, a recognition that the difficult years following her father's death had ultimately led her toward a life she could scarcely have imagined during those hardest, most uncertain days. As the wedding date finally arrived, Ashbourne Manor transformed into a scene of quiet, joyful celebration. The gardens where Alexander had first walked Clara through the tenant farms were now filled with carefully arranged flowers. The library, where they had spent hours discussing literature, now hosted a small gathering of close friends and family, awaiting the ceremony. And Eleanor, dressed in her finest gown despite her continued frailty, sat in a place of honor near the front of the small chapel on the estate grounds, her face radiant with a happiness that seemed, for that one precious day, to push aside every concern about her failing health. Alexander stood at the altar, watching, as Clara made her way toward him, dressed in a simple, elegant gown that suited her far better than the elaborate fashions Eleanor had initially suggested. She carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had shown from their very first meeting, though her eyes, meeting his across the length of the small chapel, held an emotion neither had allowed themselves to fully express during their earliest, more cautious conversations. "You look radiant," Alexander said softly, once she had reached his side. "You look nervous," Clara replied, a teasing smile touching her lips despite the solemnity of the occasion. "I am considerably more nervous than I expected to be," Alexander admitted, "though I suspect that has more to do with how thoroughly you have come to matter to me, rather than any doubt about the choice I am making today." As the ceremony began, Eleanor watched from her seat with quiet, overwhelming satisfaction, understanding that whatever time remained to her, she had lived to see the very thing she had hoped for since first witnessing Clara's kindness during her illness years earlier. A match, built not on convenience or calculation, but on genuine, hard-won love that had survived scandal, forgery, and betrayal, to arrive, finally, at this moment of quiet celebration. Neither Alexander nor Clara could yet know what challenges the years ahead might bring, nor how the loss of Eleanor, whenever it eventually arrived, would test the foundation they had built together. But standing before their small gathering of witnesses, hands joined and eyes locked on one another, both understood with complete certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together, exactly as they had faced every obstacle since their very first, unexpected meeting in that drawing room so many weeks before. The wedding vows were simple, exactly as Clara had requested and Alexander had happily agreed to, neither wishing for the elaborate, performative ceremony that society might have expected from a duke's marriage. I, Alexander, take you, Clara, not because my grandmother chose you for me, though I am forever grateful that she did, Alexander said, his voice steady, despite the emotion evident beneath his words, but because I choose you myself, freely and completely, understanding exactly who you are, and loving you entirely for it. Clara's eyes glistened with tears she made no effort to hide, as she offered her own vows in return. I, Clara, take you, Alexander, understanding that I came to you with nothing but honesty to offer, and finding, against every expectation I carried, that honesty was precisely what you valued most. I choose you today, and every day that follows, exactly as freely as you have chosen me. When the ceremony concluded, and they were pronounced husband and wife, the small gathering erupted into genuine, warm applause, and Eleanor, watching from her seat of honor, allowed tears of pure joy to fall freely down her weathered cheeks, for the first time in longer than anyone present could remember. The celebration that followed extended well into the evening, filled with laughter and warmth that stood in sharp, welcome contrast to the tension and scandal that had defined the preceding weeks. Tenant families from the surrounding farms, many of whom Clara had befriended during her early visits with Alexander, arrived to offer their congratulations, their genuine affection for the new Duchess, evident in every warm greeting and heartfelt well-wish. You have brought something to this family that has been missing for a very long time, Eleanor told Clara privately, during a quiet moment away from the larger celebration. Not simply an heir, should you and Alexander be blessed with children, but genuine warmth, genuine connection between this family and the people whose lives depend upon it. I learned that from watching you, in many ways, Clara replied. The kindness you showed me during your illness, asking nothing in return, taught me that true nobility has very little to do with titles, and considerably more to do with how one treats those who can offer nothing back. Eleanor smiled, though her strength had visibly waned over the course of the long celebration. I am tired, my dear, but it is a good tiredness. The tiredness of a woman who has finally seen her hopes fulfilled. Alexander, noticing his grandmother's fatigue, gently insisted she retire for the evening, and as servants helped her toward her chamber, Eleanor paused at the doorway, looking back at the celebration continuing in the gardens beyond, at her grandson standing beside his new wife, surrounded by genuine friends and grateful tenants, rather than the calculating society figures who had once filled Ashbourne Manor's halls during Alexander's earlier, unsuccessful courtships. Thank you, she said softly, though it was unclear whether the words were meant for Clara, for Alexander, or simply offered quietly, to whatever fate had allowed her to witness this particular outcome, before her own time finally came to an end. In the months that followed, Eleanor's health continued its gradual decline, though she remained present for many of the early joys of Alexander and Clara's marriage, watching with quiet satisfaction as they settled into a partnership built on the same honest, direct communication that had characterized their courtship from its very beginning. She lived long enough to learn that Clara was expecting their first child, a piece of news that brought her more genuine happiness than any other moment since the wedding itself. I will not live to see the child born, I think, Eleanor told Clara privately, some months after the joyful announcement, her voice weaker than it had been even at the wedding. But knowing that this family's future is secure, knowing that you and Alexander have built something genuine, rather than merely convenient, allows me to face what comes next, with considerably more peace than I expected to feel. You have given us everything, Eleanor, Clara said, taking the old woman's frail hand in her own. I would not have found this happiness without your stubborn insistence that I meet your impossible, difficult grandson. Eleanor laughed weakly at this, the sound bringing genuine warmth to a conversation, otherwise heavy with the unspoken knowledge of what lay ahead. He was always worth the trouble, Clara. He simply needed someone patient enough, and honest enough, to see past his careful defenses. Eleanor passed peacefully several weeks later, surrounded by family, in the same manner she had spent her final years working to secure for future generations. Her passing brought genuine grief to Alexander and Clara both, though it was tempered by the knowledge that she had lived to see her greatest hope fulfilled, a marriage built on genuine love rather than calculated convenience, a family finally restored to the warmth and connection that had defined the Hartley name in generations long past. In the years that followed, Alexander and Clara built a life together that honored everything Eleanor had hoped for when she first arranged their unlikely meeting. Their household became known throughout the county, not for elaborate displays of wealth or status, but for genuine warmth, extended to everyone who crossed its threshold, from visiting nobility to the tenant families, whose welfare Clara continued to champion, with the same directness and care she had shown from her very first visit to the estate's farms. Their children, 3 in total over the following years, grew up hearing the story of their parents' unlikely courtship, of a grandmother's stubborn insistence, of a scandal, overcome through honesty rather than concealment, of a love that had proven, in the end, stronger than every obstacle placed deliberately in its path. Edmund Grayson, whose desperate schemes had nearly destroyed everything Alexander and Clara built together, lived out his remaining years in quiet, diminished circumstances far from London society, his reputation never fully recovering from the exposure of his deliberate deception. He made no further attempts to interfere in his cousin's happiness, understanding, perhaps too late, that the inheritance he had so desperately coveted had never been worth the cost of the cruelty he had inflicted in pursuit of it. And at Ashbourne Manor, generations later, visitors touring the estate's grounds would sometimes pause before a small portrait hanging in the manor's library, depicting a duke and duchess whose story had become something of a local legend, a tale told not of grand romance built on wealth and status, but of 2 people who had found, against every expectation either had carried into their unlikely first meeting, exactly what they had never known they were searching for. A love built not on performance, but on honesty, not on calculation, but on genuine kindness, offered without expectation of reward. And though the scandal that had once threatened to destroy that love had long since faded from memory, replaced by generations of quieter, happier stories, the lesson at its heart remained, passed down through the Hartley family for years to come, that true worth had very little to do with title or fortune, and everything to do with the quiet, steady character, revealed only when no one was watching, and nothing stood to be gained from kindness freely given.